This is chapter 13, language. And language is any formal system of gestures, signs, sounds, and symbols used or conceived as a means of communicating thought. Again, any formal system of gestures, signs, sounds, and symbols used or conceived as a means of communicating thought. It's really important because it's the primary means through which humans have the ability to communicate and interact with each other. So it's an important aspect of our lives. The basic functions of language are assigning meaning to words. That's really important. Words consist of sounds and shapes that have agreed upon meanings, and these are based in concepts, ideas, and memories. So for example, blue, when we say, what is blue? We might be referring to a portion of the visual spectrum dominated by wavelengths of roughly 440 to 490 nanometers, or we could say that the color in question is an equal mixture of red and green light. If you hear blue, you might also think of your favorite color, the sky on a spring day, your car, all sorts of different things come to mind when you think of blue. You might also think of the mood of being blue. I'm a little blue today. So we have two different types of definitions you do need to know about. The first one is the denotative meaning, and this is the specific meaning associated with the word. And I always think of denotative as the dictionary meaning. Denotative dictionaries both start with the D. Then the other type of definition is the connotative, and with the connotative meaning, this is the idea suggested by or associated with a word. So we have a lot of different connotative meanings, especially when we're dealing with slang. So if you say something's nasty, are you saying it's gross, or are you saying like it's super cool, or it's fabulous? You know, it just depends. Or salty. Are you talking about taste, or are you talking about she's angry, or he's a little upset? Salty. So that's the connotative meaning. Now, oral and written language have a lot of differences, and there are 12 main ones, and we'll go through them very briefly. Oral language has a smaller variety of words. Oral language has words with fewer syllables. It has shorter sentences. It has more self-reference words like I or me or mine. Oral language has fewer quantifying terms or precise numerical words. We usually just say a bunch of or less than. We don't say 74.9. Oral language also has more pseudo-quantifying terms. So many, few, some, those are pseudo-quantifying. It has more extreme and superlative words. None, all, every, many, all, always, never. Oral language also has more qualifying statements. So things beginning with unless, except. Oral language also has more repetition of words and syllables. It uses more contractions and more interjections, like, wow, really, no. And oral language has more colloquial and non-standard words. And these differences exist basically because we have to reiterate ourselves. We use a lot of the same information over and over again. And when we're writing something, if it's written versus oral, we have time to go back and edit it. When you're talking, it just sometimes falls out of your mouth, and you have to work with it. And that's why we have those interjections, or we have clauses, qualifying statements, pseudo-quantifying, because we don't have time to really come up with the exact number of whatever it is we're looking for. So moving to using language effectively, we want to use appropriate language in our speeches and in everyday life. And by appropriate, we mean if the language is suitable or fitting for the audience. And four considerations you need to think about. Is it appropriate for the speaker? You know, does it fit in your speaking pattern? Do those words, are they okay with you? Is basically what it's saying. The language you select needs to be suitable for you, okay? The second consideration is appropriate for the audience. You know, is the language you're choosing appropriate for whoever you're talking to? If you're talking to kindergartners, you're probably going to use different language than if you're talking to your peers versus if you're talking to the chancellor, right? So it has to be appropriate for the audience. It also has to be appropriate for the context. Is it suitable or fitting for the context itself? And this includes the occasion, the time of day, the mood of the audience, and any other factors that sort of play a part in the physical context. And then finally, is it appropriate for the topic? Is the language appropriate for that specific topic you're talking about? So if you're talking about the early years of the Walt Disney Company, would you want to refer to Walt Disney as thaumaturgic individuals, or do you want to talk about them as people who work wonders or miracles? Now, if you're talking really specific jargony type things to experts on this, then thaumaturgic is the right word. But if you're talking to anybody else, you want to say, oh, these are people who work wonders, they work miracles, they're working at Walt Disney World. In addition, when you're using language effectively, you want to use vivid language. And vivid language is language that helps audience members create strong, distinct, clear, and memorable mental images. Helps audience members create strong, distinct, clear, and memorable mental images. Good vivid language helps an audience truly understand and imagine what the speaker's talking about. And imagery is defined as the use of language to represent objects, actions, or ideas. So concrete language is language that helps people see specific realities or actual instances instead of abstract concepts or theories. And the goal of concreteness is to show an audience something specific. So like in a couple chapters ago when I showed you my dog, I said, here is my dog. This is very concrete versus man's best friend or my furry little guy. That's more abstract. Another way to add imagery is to use similes. Similes are figures of speech in which two unlike things are explicitly compared. We usually use like or as, or I'm sorry, not usually, all similes use like or as. So it's, I always think, is dumb as a box of hair. So I use as, or that's my best one. Dumb as a box of rocks, dumb as a box of hair. You want to look for instances where you're already finding yourself using like or as, and those are good examples of where you could insert a simile right there. You want to check that mental picture for yourself to see if you can get that vivid imagery of, okay, this is like that, or she's like that, or that as a box of hair. Are you imagining that or not? So that's how you kind of check on if the simile is effective. You can also use metaphors, and metaphors are a figure of speech where a term or phrase is applied to something in a non-literal way to suggest a resemblance. And so you want to, one of the comparison items is usually said to actually be the other. So the lake is glass. When the lake's really calm, you say the lake is glass. You want to determine what you're describing. And again, you want to say it out loud and see if you're also getting the imagery that you mean to be giving to your audience. Rhythm is another way to be vivid. Oh, I'm sorry. So for the vivid language, we have imagery using similes and metaphors. And we also have rhythm then under this. And rhythm refers to the patterned recurring variance of elements of sound or speech. The patterned recurring variance of elements of sound or speech. And we do this through a variety of different ways. We can use parallelism, and this is just the idea that audiences respond more strongly when ideas are presented in a grammatically parallel fashion. And we talk a lot about this when dealing with outlining principles. They're more likely to remember ideas when they're expressed in the same fashion. It's just easier to remember X, Y, and Z versus sometimes X and then a little bit of Y. Z is also, if you're having sentence structure, keep it the same, parallel ideas. Repetition is another form of rhythm that helps. The oral linguistic device where keywords or phrases are repeated in an attempt to help audience members recall the words or phrases. And so again, because speeches are oral, audience members need to hear those core messages over and over again. That's the repetition. And by repeating a phrase during a speech, you do create a specific rhythm. For example, the I have a dream speech uses a lot of repetition. I have a dream that one day, I have a dream. And so that's a great example of repetition that creates good rhythm. Alliteration is another thing that adds rhythm. And this is the repeating of 2 or more words in a series with the same consonant. So like, these are like tongue twisters. Silly Sally sells seashells by the seashore. That would be an immediate juxtaposition, alliteration, using the same sound or letter to begin each word in the sentence. And then we have assonance, sorry. This is the form of rhyming pattern where the same vowel sounds are used with different consonants. So like, how now, brown cow, is an example of a rhyming pattern because the vowels sound the same, but the consonants are changed. You want to be very careful with using this one because when it's overused, it can turn into some bad poetry, it can turn into some bad Dr. Seuss stuff. So be very careful with that. Next, we want to make sure we're using inclusive language. And this avoids placing any one group of people above or below other groups when you're speaking. And you do this by avoiding gender-specific language. And this might be the generic he. A lot of times we'll just say, oh, he, instead of saying he or she. And this is a throwback to long ago when all people were referred to as he in literary terms. So avoid that. The use of man is also something to avoid. Man, mankind, or you guys. You don't want to use words like that because guys indicates men, so it indicates you're leaving the women out. So instead of saying, hey guys, you might want to say, hey everyone. And I'm guilty of this too. I say, hey guys, or okay, you guys. I say that often, which is something I need to work on. So if I need to work on it, maybe you should pay attention to it as well. And then we also want to, in avoiding gender-specific language, be cautious of gender-typed jobs. Yeah. And so sometimes we assume that one occupation employs one gender over the other. I'm thinking of she's a woman doctor or he's a male nurse. Those are examples of being very gender-typed. You don't have to say she's a woman. She's a woman who's a doctor. You can say she's a doctor or he's a nurse, not he's a male nurse. There's no difference between being a male nurse and being a nurse. You don't get a special star on your name tag or anything. Maybe you do. No, you probably don't. So using inclusive language by avoiding gender-specific language. Ethnic identity is also key here. And this refers to a group an individual identifies with based on a common culture. That's your ethnic identity. And within the US, we have numerous ethnic groups. And if you want to be safe, the best thing you can do is ask a couple people from the ethnic group how they prefer to label themselves if you're going to be referring to an ethnic group in your speech. Also within inclusive language, we have sexual orientation. So we have a lot of heterosexism, and this is when speakers presume that everyone in the audience is heterosexual or that opposite sex relationships are the norm. Generally speaking, you just want to say your partners or significant others. Those are good terms to use instead of saying, oh, you know, when you get married, if you're a guy and you marry a girl, or if you're a girl and you marry a guy, you can't say that. So if you know, when you get married, when you find a partner, when you find a significant other. And generally speaking, it's best to use the phrase members of the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender, transsexual community, or members of the LGBT community, instead of the more clinical term of homosexual. So the preference here is LGBTQ. Disability is another aspect of using inclusive language. And so speakers sometimes can accidentally use language demeaning to individuals with physical or mental disabilities. So you just always want to be aware of your word choices and what they can mean. Next, you want to use familiar language. Language that's both familiar to yourself and to your audience. If you're not comfortable with the language you're using, it's going to come out weird. You're going to have nervous speaking, and that's going to impact how your audience receives your speech. You have to be comfortable with whatever words you're using. So if you're not comfortable talking about sex and body parts, you might not want to do an informative speech on condoms because you would feel uncomfortable with that. And I had that happen once. Someone was so embarrassed, they thought he thought he'd be funny by talking about this, and really he got up in front, he was red, blushing, so nervous, stammering, couldn't get the words out. So use language that you're comfortable and familiar with. And if your audience can't understand what you're saying, if you're trying to use too clinical of words, you're not going to have an effective speech, which is the key to public speaking. Next, we have the 6 elements of language. First, we have clarity, and this is the use of language to make sure the audience understands a speaker's ideas in the way the speaker intended. The use of language to make sure the audience understands a speaker's ideas in the way the speaker intended. So you might not want to have polysyllabic words, and those are words that are really long. See, polysyllabic? You're like, ooh, I don't know what she's talking about. You might not want to use long words because sometimes your audience doesn't know what you're talking about. You want to be clear. Some fun examples. Older female relative who became aerodynamic venison roadkill. You're actually saying grandma got run over by a reindeer. So, or an obese personification fabricated of compressed mounds of minute crystals is actually Frosty the Snowman. It's fun, but clear language makes a difference in how well your message can be understood. Second element, economy. And this is the use of only those words necessary to accurately express your idea. A lot of times new public speakers think that the more words they use, the more impressive they will sound. No, that's not quite how it works. And so you don't want to be, but at the same time, you also don't want to become so overly basic that you're perceived as talking down to your audience. You want to find a nice middle ground there. Third element, obscenity or indecent language. So this consists of curse words or pornographic references. It might be fun to use obscene language in casual conversations with your friends. I'm not recommending this at all. You should not use obscene language in your public speeches. It's not appropriate for the context, not appropriate formality, not appropriate for all audience members. And even if you're giving a speech related to an obscene word, be careful with your use of the word itself. When speakers use obscenity, the audience tends to then focus on the fact that they're being obscene versus what the message is. So there's my caution to you. Fourth, obscure language or jargon. Obscure language refers to language choices not typically understood or known by most of your audience. And it's related to jargon, which is language commonly used by a highly specialized group, trade, or profession. So if you are a computer person talking about the different bits and bytes and dongle cables and binary and just all sorts of jargon, your audience isn't going to understand that unless they're also a group in that highly specialized profession. So very careful there with obscure language or jargon. The fifth element is power, and this is an individual's ability to influence another person to think or behave in a manner that the other person would not have otherwise done. So this is just someone's ability to influence somebody else. Now, I've said it before, language, words, very powerful. Powerful language is language that enhances an audience perception of the speaker's credibility. And we have a lot of different types of powerful language. The text talked about 3. First is the direct request. And this is what asking the audience to engage in a certain behavior. Wear your seatbelt, wear a helmet. You're asking them, please do this. Or at the conclusions of today's speech, I want you to go out and buy a bottle of hand sanitizer and save your life or not get a cold or whatever. Bargaining is another type of powerful language. And this is an agreement that affects both parties in a situation. If you vote for me, I promise to make sure our schools get the funding they need. So you're bargaining. And the third type is ingratiation. And this is attempting to bring oneself into the favor or good graces of an audience. Because you're all smart and talented people, I know you're going to side with me. You're kind of buttering them up. It's called ingratiation. We do have some powerless language that you'll want to be aware of, so you don't use it in your speeches. And powerless language is language that should be avoided in public speaking because it can damage audience perception of speaker credibility. We do this in a variety of ways. First, through hesitation. And this makes you sound unprepared or uncertain. This is like, well, as best as I could figure out, I mean, from what I could find, I think it's pretty interesting. Shows some hesitation. Intensifiers are another type of powerless language. These overemphasize all aspects of the speech. It's great, fantastic, this topic is awesome, oh, that's awesome, great. It's like everything can't be great. You have to pick and choose where you're going to intensify, right? And then we have disqualifiers. This is when you're downplaying your own qualifications and competence about a topic. It's like, well, I'm not really an expert on this topic, and I'm not really very good at doing research, but I'm going to tell you what I do know. That's not good. And then we have tag questions, and these are questions added to the end of a phrase seeking the audience's consent for what was said. So this is a behavior. This is important, right? Don't you think? You should really do this, right? Is this okay? So these are the tag questions, and unfortunately, it turns out that women use tag questions a lot, right? So be careful of those. And then we have self-critical statements, and this is when you downplay your own abilities and make your lack of confidence public. Like, oh, I have to tell you, I'm not very good at public speaking, but I'm just going to go ahead and give my speech anyway. Or I don't really know what I'm doing up here, so I'll just do my best. Those are self-critical. Hedges are another type of powerless language, and this is when you indicate you're not really sure of the statement. It's like, oh, I really believe this is true, sort of, and maybe my conclusion's good, possibly not. Or, you should do this, if you want to. And so you're hedging. You make a strong statement, and then you're like, if you want to, if it's okay with you. And then verbal surrogates are also used, and these are utterances used to fill space when you're speaking. They're also called filler words. Wow, my mouth is all of a sudden not working. It's like I was gonna say something that is maybe important. It's natural to use filler words because we're uncomfortable with silence. We want to indicate to others that we're thinking. Your turn to talk is not quite yet, but you want to avoid that when you can. And one way to avoid filler words is to practice, prepare, and so you're ready to go. You're not searching for the next thing going. And my next point, here it is this. So you want to avoid that. So that deals with power. And then the final component is variety. And variety deals with a speaker's ability to use and implement a range of different language choices. And so, all the different characteristics we talked about in this chapter fall under here. We want to use different language devices. If you use the same language device too often, it starts to lose its power. You can't use alliterations all the time. You can't use metaphors all the time. You have to mix it up a little bit. And you really want to think about the language you plan on using and make sure that you use a range of language choices as you're going through that. So that is chapter 13 with language.